Yo, I'm just trying to make pimping my stuff a little bit more fun. So I have a YouTube channel, which is where you're probably watching this. That's post-mortem video. I have a second channel called Grimstream. Not got the proper name yet, but if you search for it, you should find it. And if you're trying to stop sucking at the teat of YouTube, you can always head on over to BitChute and find me at GrimJim. Hello lovelies. I'm going to do something profoundly un-British and quite out of character for me today. I'm going to talk about money. And money as it relates to freelancing and self-publishing and so forth, particularly in the role-playing world, but also more broadly in the creative community. And as I say, this is rather un-British. I don't tend to like to talk about these things. I feel quite uncomfortable doing so. I'm well aware of the luck and fortune that I've had and the graft I've put in and the fortuitous circumstances in which I find myself, for which I am, of course, eternally grateful, and that not everyone has these opportunities and so forth. But there has been quite a bit of discussion. There was a big thread yesterday in which tempers were fraught on Twitter, apparently. I haven't managed to track down the thread, but someone's given me a little summary. So I'm going to use this as a sort of springboard, and it kind of makes sense at the start of the year to go into this, to talk about the role-playing industry, self-publishing, creative work in general, money, finances, all of these sorts of things. So, the UK minimum wage, if you're working 5 days a week, 9 to 5, minus an hour for lunch, with, say, 3 weeks of holiday, with bank holidays included within that 3 weeks, yeah, that works out to around £15,000 a year. The living wage isn't much more than that, perhaps slightly closer to 16,000 a year. There's not that much difference between the two here in the UK, unless you live in London, in which case it's about 20 to 30% higher than that for minimum and living wage, basically requirements in order to be able to survive in London. London is a special case, and its salaries tend to be higher because of that, because of the price of housing and all the rest of it. In reality, of course, if you're working for yourself or you're freelancing, doing other things, you probably won't get any of that holiday, and you'll probably be working more than 9 to 5, quite honestly. So there you go. Now, I turn over as Postmortem Studios about 18,000 Great British pounds per year, roughly, at the moment. But that's for everything I do. That's not just the role-playing work, it's all the little side gigs and freelancing and consultation and everything else that I do results in a turnover of about £18,000. After costs and everything, it's probably closer to that 15,000 minimum wage. But like I say, that's because of everything that I do. And when you are freelancing, when you are a creative person in this climate in which we find ourselves, you have to make everything that you do pay to one degree or another. You know, the saying is, you do something you love, you never work a day in your life, but you also never have a day off, which is something that people neglect to tell you about. So that's about $22,000. Federal minimum wage in the US is only about $12,000. The $15 sort of minimum wage would be about double that. So if you take in the desired minimum wage in the States, we're talking roughly the same sort of ballpark area, right? But like I say, that's with everything that I do. And you should also keep in mind that I have a safe and secure roof over my head that I essentially own. It's complicated, but essentially I will never get thrown out of here. So I essentially own my house. I have a car I don't run very much, so it doesn't cost me very much. I don't have a great deal of household overheads and so on. There's a lot of things I could cut back if I desperately needed to. My partner is in a very secure and well-paying job and supports me in what I do. Like I said, I'm pretty lucky. I've got no real dependents other than a couple of cats So yeah, that's okay for me. Now, what do I do to create that turnover and that profit? In 2019, I put out around 13 products, but they were kind of loaded towards the end of the year, so they're not in full swing of sales and so on. I also did a couple of charity things, a audiobook and a YouTube video series, basically reading out the pertinent parts of the 5th edition D&D SRD, for which I get nothing. Basically, maybe a little YouTube money, but not very much. I did the Zealot Scholarship at the beginning of last year. I haven't done it this year, though I have commissioned some pieces of art. So that's another charitable thing that I do. I also occasionally do a bit of freelancing, though that's been drying up more and more in recent years, in partly due to social media drama, but partly due to the fact that more and more companies are taking these things in-house, and there just isn't as much freelancing available as there used to be. I'm a bit unusual at the moment in that I do hire some people freelance to do some bits and pieces for me. I do advice and consulting. I sell hard copies of my game in one place, PDFs in another place, print-on-demand versions of card games and board games, which hardly have any profit, but it's nice to have a hard copy version out there. And also last year I invested quite a lot of money, time and effort in the election party game that isn't in full swing either yet. So I say I do some advice and consulting, quite reasonably priced, I think. I think I charge $20 an hour, thereabouts, when it comes up with advice like this to people. So if you want to pay for some one-on-one advice, if you want to start up writing stuff for gaming, yeah, I can answer more direct and particular questions there. Last year I also published a novelette, Alice Through the Garbage Grinder, and I've done some fiction before. I'm in some anthologies under pen names. I write a little bit of erotica on the side under a pen name, so that contributes. And I've got a previous novel and a non-fiction book out as well. That kind of stuff doesn't tend to pay as well as my role-playing work, the non-fiction book being an exception to that rule. But all of these things have a sort of long-term, long-tail sales thing. I do YouTube. Now I have nearly 3,000 subscribers, and I get around 200 on average hits per video, which isn't a lot, but that gets me somewhere between $15 and $50 per month, depending if I have a particularly good month or a video takes off or goes semi-viral for me, which is about 10,000 hits or whatever. YouTube's a bit of a sticky wicket though lately. Every time I get to an average of about 200 views per video, they change something and the algorithm bones me and it drops back down to about 100. So I'm expecting that to happen again anytime soon. The golden days of YouTube are behind us. Just about anything will get your video down-rated, won't show up so often in search results. When you put out a video, the reminders don't go out to all your subscribers properly. There's all kinds of issues with YouTube, from censorship to incompetence. It's very much in a decline. It's also useful though to have videos of me talking about my games, talking about advice like this, adverts for my games and so on. There's some kind of indiscernible knock-on effect of sales of other stuff that I do, and attention that is then drawn to other things that I do, my social media and all the rest of it. I've begun podcasting. I do interviews and things with people fairly often on their podcasts. I'm starting up doing that for myself and with a few collaborators. Unfortunately, I can't monetize that through the options that I've got because I'm in the UK, but I'm hoping that will pick up. Seems that there's more money, more attention and more interest in podcasting these days than there is in YouTube, which is interesting, but we'll see how that goes. I have a Patreon and a Subscribe Star. On those I am doing a series of videos about the role-playing industry, so if you want to see anything more in-depth about all of this, if you're a subscriber, you get access to those videos. They will be on sale eventually if you want more advice. But I do tend to give things away for free like this, which is part of where I go wrong. Crowdfunding. I'm a bit gun-shy of crowdfunding, but I have used it now and then to support projects. It's a real minefield. Maybe I'll talk about that a bit more in a sec. And I blog. Role-playing stuff on one, story stuff on another, bits and pieces here and there elsewhere. Now, if you're in the RPG industry and you're selling electronic copies of your books, it's mostly done in PDF format because it supports all the layout and art and so on better than other ebook formats, and you're probably going to be selling on what is essentially the only platform for that, which is DriveThruRPG. There's a couple of others, but they don't get anything like the same kind of volume or attention or money. I've also, however, set up my own website now to sell more directly because there are similarly censorship issues and so on DriveThruRPG, which makes it a less viable proposition. So I'm kind of transitioning to selling on there, but also selling through my own site, so I don't lose all that money to the cut that they take. More on that in a minute. Conventions. I haven't been in a few years. Like social media and like other environments, conventions have become pretty hostile. If you're slightly edgy or you produce a product that touches on any sensitive issues that people might have, conflict is where the story is, but everyone is so risk averse and so willing to point the finger at anybody and everybody else that conventions have felt unwelcoming for some time and a less profitable prospect. Now, I used to make money fairly easily when I went to conventions. These were smaller conventions. The multi-day one I went to was IndieCon. The one-day one I went to was Dragon Meet. Dragon Meet was very much a seller's convention then. I haven't been since they've been to the new place. I haven't gone to UK Games Expo. It seems a bit expensive and a long way to go, and then there's all the housing and so on for the time that it's on. So conventions, it's a high risk, high reward sort of thing these days. But if you're not doing something mainstream or politically acceptable at a very sort of surface level, I don't know that the risk is worth it. Check the policies, make sure they wouldn't censor you, or someone couldn't censor you by kicking up a stink before you go. Self-marketing is something that I'm terrible at, as you can tell by the awkward intro to this video, but it is an integral part of any creative's life now. You are a brand, you need to project that brand, you need to be on message, you need to get yourself out there. I find that incredibly awkward and I'm not terribly good at it. But if you are good at that, then that's great. But the trouble is, to be a successful creative in this climate, you have to have many strings to your bow. You have to be able to self-market. You have to, build a brand of yourself, your own personal brand identity, and so on. And it's all terribly sort of Web 2.0 jargon, and it all gets in the way of that pure creativity. And odds are you're not going to be good at all of these things. If you're good at writing, then you're probably not that good at art. If you're good at art, that doesn't necessarily mean you're good at video editing. If you're good at all of those things, you might have the most obnoxious personality in the world and nobody wants to listen to you or buy anything because you end up pissing them off. It's tricky. Alright, so let's talk about costs and pay. When I started around, well, for myself fully, I would say full-time, 2004, 2005-ish, I could expect to be paid somewhere between 3 and 6 cents per word. This is terrible by the broader standards of the writing, editing, and so on community. You normally would expect to be paid quite a lot more than that, even with the collapse of print media and so on. But that hasn't really essentially changed very much at all since then. The costs have and the payments have stagnated, which is good when you're making stuff and hiring people, less good when you're looking for work and trying to make a living at all of this. Art, similarly, you would expect to pay perhaps $100 for an A4 or US letter black and white piece, double that for colour, half that for half that size, and so on. That has also stagnated for the vast majority of people, unless you're a name artist whose work will attract a following and get people's attention and all the rest of it. Both of these have stagnated. So we should be paying kind of minimum entry level of at least 4 to 5 cents per word, and we should be paying at least $150 for an A4 piece of black and white art. We don't, and that's something that needs to change. But equally, PDF prices, for example, haven't really changed in that same period, even though we should be paying essentially half again on top of what we once were. The whole thing is stagnated. There's a glut of stuff on the market. The barrier to entry is low, which as a creative person I think is great, because everyone can get their work out there. But it also means that there's a lot out there, and you have to somehow try and find a way to cut through all that and get an audience. There's also a lot of people who do it for free. So yeah, the pressure is really on for you to provide value for money, to compete with all these people who are doing it for free, or who are doing it as a side gig and never expect to make any money out of it. Yeah, you're competing with all of them, and it's also increasingly hard to provide that value for money because the profit margins simply aren't there at the moment, at least, to really hire anybody, get good art. You can get stock art on, which helps support artists. I highly recommend that. But then your same art will be seen in various products, and it might not necessarily be an exact fit for your product, and so on. You're being kind of squeezed from two directions. There's a run on game streaming and so on at the moment, because a handful of them have gotten really big and famous, attracted a lot of attention. It's looked like there's money in it. So there's been a bit of a gold rush and a fame rush for that. So there's huge amounts of competition there. And if you're just sitting down and having a game like people normally do, you're probably not going to attract any attention without costumes or voice changing software, or budgets, things to make it more presentable. If you're role playing in its wild natural state, it's extremely unlikely to attract a great deal of viewers or anything. Plus, it's hard to get groups together online unless you have a regular sort of physical meetup point, and then streaming games can make people rather uncomfortable as well, which is another issue. Certainly even as someone with getting on for 35 years role-playing experience, I get nervous about streaming games. It costs me a lot in terms of confidence to try and do it. I keep meaning to try and do it more, but I'm also acutely aware that the presentation isn't necessarily there, and all the rest of it. So it's tricky, and there are all these people who do it for free who you have to compete with, but you don't really have the resources to compete with people who are doing it for free and pouring their free time and their enthusiasm into it without really looking for much in the way of reward. The community is also trash at the moment. I tend towards the free speech end of things. I'm interested in controversial subjects, which gets me called an edgy boy quite a lot, but there are these kind of two camps firing constant fusillades of abuse and so on at each other, the ultra woke and the reactionary. And if you have even the slightest inclination one way or another, you'll be sorted by some sort of twisted evil sorting hat into one camp or the other. Even especially if you have a more nuanced position on all of these things, like you think diversity is good but not for its own sake, right? You find that to be tokenism and patronising and unhelpful. Or if you're pro free speech and you think that horror games should be horrific and that trigger warnings shouldn't amount to spoilers, but you recognise that some people have trauma, you just put the onus on them to handle their own issues. yeah, that's wrong, and that's the thing that makes self-marketing so difficult. People will hear things about you second, third, fourth hand, won't ever bother to check. They'll just block you out of their life immediately. This leads into the problems with conventions. There's anti-harassment policies, for example. Nobody wants there to be harassment. It's really an issue for law enforcement, but it makes the convention look good, and it satiates that mob on one side of the argument a bit if you have an anti-harassment policy. But they're often extremely open to abuse, unjust, and overstep their bounds to becoming more about censorship and control. But of course, if you bring that up, you must be pro-harassment. It's absurd, it's toxic, it's ridiculous. If you can tap into one of those camps, then you can make a certain amount of bank off the back of that. But if you don't really fit into that camp into which you've been slotted, people will start to turn on you. You know, this is a problem. You have to market yourself, but the community is trash. The cheapest, most cost-effective way to market yourself is social media, and yet at the same time, it's a horror show. Cover price. There is this psychological barrier at around $9.99, right? If you've got a 100-page book or supplement, A4 or US letter, going for about that seems to be the kind of sweet spot, and has been for a very long time, even though we should be charging about, that sweet spot should be around $14.99 now, but it isn't. And I don't know how it'll all shake down if you try raising your prices like that. PDF pricing is tricky. I mean, there's no physical book to make and reproduce and ship, which is where a lot of the costs come in, and they usually come out of your pocket as the publisher. If you look at the cover price of a game, production cost is maybe a fifth to a fourth of that, and then whatever remains gets split between the creator, the distributor, if there is one, and the shop, if there is one. Selling PDFs cuts out some of that, so it's really just you, and there's no production cost for further copies, and the distributor, but they're going to be taking about a third. And there's the costs of production, obviously, as well, in terms of your time, your effort, the money you put into it, the money you pay out for art. Maybe you pay writers, maybe you don't, maybe you pay an editor, maybe you don't. Yeah, and these are all things that negatively impact the perceived value of your game. Now this is more of a thing in writing, but if you're charging like 99 cents for a novel that you've written, everyone charges 99 cents for a novel. People have no real concept of value, and paradoxically you can sell more copies. You can give your book a bit more cachet by upping the price slightly. It seems absurd, it seems weird, but it's true. But there doesn't seem to be that same flexibility and willingness to pay out in the RPG hobby. We're all cheapskates. A lot of it has this DIY aesthetic, so why would you pay out over the odds for something you can make yourself is often the question. And the downside of PDFs is they're eminently piratable, so you have to consider that. Margins are pretty razor thin anyway, so alright, well, let's say these numbers are largely pulled out of my ass, but we'll go with them. To get that 15k a year living, you would need to produce about 30 products per year at that $10 value, selling about 50 copies each. The amount of sales is a fairly unambitious target. 50 is probably what you can manage over the course of a reasonable period of time with minimal marketing and tapping in somewhat to some kind of existing market or existing reputation. But that's without any of the overheads in terms of art, etc. You're going to be wanting to pay out at least $200 on art, and let's cut the editing, and let's say you do all the writing yourself and you just use various free methods to edit. So you can have a slightly substandard text, patchy artwork, and maybe sell 50 copies. And 20 of those, more than 20 of those, due to the distributor taking a cut, is going to go on paying for what you just made. It just demonstrates how impossible this is, really. Can you come up with 30 ideas for a product that's 100 pages or so that you can sell for $9.99? It's a big oof. It's a big ask. Of course, as you continue to produce content, the stuff you've already created draws attention and sells more as well. And if you've got hardy perennial products like I have, my Adventure Seeds books, or some of the other bits and pieces, they will continue to sell reasonably well forever. it seems like, and that helps create an audience and keep you on going. So perennial products is a good thing to invest time and effort and money in, things that you think are going to sell continuously for a very long time. A lot of PDFs are overpriced for the market. Why? I don't know. I think partly because of the piracy issue. I think also people don't want to undermine the sales of hard copies and the business that local game stores and so on do. A lot of people will bundle a free PDF if you buy the print copy, that sort of thing. A couple of examples tend to come up. Invisible Sun is one of them. Now they're charging $99 for the PDFs for Invisible Sun. That is a lot. But the hard copy is about $400. And it's a big event game, several hardback books, a box, cards, stuff, right? So there is an added value there to the physical item that can't be replicated in the PDF. But a good rule of thumb generally is that a PDF should be at least half the price of the print to seem like a reasonable cost. With Invisible Sun, $99 is a bargain compared to the hard copy, but you don't get all those neat little toys and the presentation and that kind of boutique quality. That's where some people are going, these kind of boutique RPGs with all kinds of special stuff, or boutique board games with all this special stuff and high quality miniatures and so on. You got to rely on whales to make that work, and crowdfunding. The other comparison that people like to tend to draw is Modiphius, whose PDFs are perceived as being rather overpriced for what they are. They're not too bad. They're not as bad as I thought, or as bad as they were when I researched this before, but the John Carter main rulebook, for example, goes for about $31, $32 hard copy through Amazon, which is probably cheaper than elsewhere, and their PDF goes for around $20. It's 2/3. That is over the odds, but it's not quite as bad as you might think. Yeah, it's tricky. Margins are razor thin. Everything that you sacrifice isn't necessarily noticeable, but gets you lost in this morass of people who are doing it for free. Prices haven't gone up when they should. There are these psychological barriers, like the $9.99 barrier. It is really, really tricky to get all this balanced and working, and people can say it's graft as much as they like, but a lot of it is really down to luck. The graft comes in when you exploit that luck. So do I have any words of wisdom for you all? Well, I told you the advantages of my position. Now I'll tell you the disadvantages. I have severe depression and crippling anxiety, which limits my ability to go to conventions even if I wanted to. I basically have no other choice than to do the work that I do, because anything else just triggers those issues that I have. I get financial support due to my mental issues, which is a big help. It basically compensates for what I've lost from not being able to work as hard. And I'm fortunate in that I have a big back catalogue of work that goes back to before there was quite this big glut of people all trying to do it and all trying to bandwagon on 5th edition or on streaming or whatever else. So I have a body of work that puts me at a significant advantage to someone coming in new. But I would say keep role-playing publishing or any other creative work as much as possible as being your side gig. maybe have a part-time job and then shore it up with your creative work. But it doesn't look like there's any relief coming anytime soon in any creative field. The bottom has fallen out of music, of art, of writing, of editing, of journalism, and it doesn't seem to be coming back in any way. There's all kinds of things that have sprung up to compensate, but keep it your side gig. Do as many different things as you can. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Write fiction as well, do art as well, sell stock art as well, do videos as well, do podcasting as well. Whatever else you can do all of it as much as possible. You know, when one thing goes down, another thing will come up, and it just creates a more reliable revenue stream, a more reliable passive revenue stream for you, and that makes the vicissitudes of life less impactful, I would say. So do as much as you can in as many different ways as you can. I see a lot of people bandwagoning on the 5th edition, particularly at the moment. The 3rd edition boom bust caused a lot of people a lot of grief. I see the same thing potentially happening with 5th edition. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. The license can change. A new edition can come along, and all that hard work can largely go to waste. There will always be diehards who stick to older editions, but most people go with the new edition, and there's no guarantee that's going to be as open again. I mean, 4th edition wasn't. Be careful. There's more games out there than D&D. Produce your own stuff, your own rule set, your own background materials, your own adventures. The adventures hardly ever sell, though. Fair warning. It's spread it out. Do multiple things. Insure yourself against sudden changes in the market or whatever else. At the same time, and this sounds paradoxical, don't overcommit. That's a big problem that I constantly have. I promise all kinds of people all kinds of things, and then I fuck myself up trying to meet those expectations and demands that I've created for myself by helping people or offering to do charity work, or cutting the money that I'm going to take in order to support a project, or paying people over the odds, or whatever else it might be. But then also just workload. Be careful that you don't overcommit and don't spend what you can't afford to spend, right? Whatever money you throw into these projects, consider it written off, and any money coming back is a bonus, right? If you take that cautious, methodical approach, or if you've got disposable income from your main work, then it can work out. Ask yourself if you really need to do a Kickstarter. Crowdfunding was great when it came along. It enabled small publishers to take risks and to create quality material at a level they couldn't otherwise, because people were willing to buy in before the product was ready. Crowdfunding has changed. It has now become more of a pre-order system, even for fairly big companies, mid-tier, high-tier, at least in the RPG industry, and that squeezed out a lot of the more amateur people that it was originally set up for. It's less about innovation, and it's more about a kind of pre-order system. So do you really need to do it? A lot of people's trust is being broken by scams on Kickstarters and crowdfunding, and by things not delivering on time or at all. Guilty, not my fault, but So do you really need to do it? If you can pay for it yourself, maybe you should avoid a Kickstarter. Kickstarters are more about pre-ordering and publicity now. So if you're going to do a crowdfunder, have your product essentially ready before you go to the Kickstarter or Indiegogo or wherever else. I know it sounds stupid and it sounds counterintuitive, but seriously. And don't overpromise. It's easy to get carried away with these sort of extension promises. Oh, we'll add this material if we reach this boundary. Pretty rapidly you create too much work for yourself, more moving pieces that can go wrong, and then you're kinda screwed. Give people as many ways as possible to support you, and make as much of that support direct as possible. Sell through your own sales point. It will take a while to break even. I've only been doing it a while. I'm just about breaking even on my own site that I'm running. But as you gradually direct more and more people there, as you create email lists, and updates. So when new stuff comes out, then it'll start paying for itself, and then it'll start paying better than it will if you're selling through distributors and sort of middlemen like Drive-Thru-RPG or whatever else. Start up a Patreon, start up a Subscribestar, give people ways to support you, but again, don't overcommit. You know, it's easy to promise the earth to people who are supporting you on these channels, and it does help smooth out the bumps, as does diversifying. But if you've only got like one guy paying you $50 a month, and you've promised stuff, all kinds of stuff in anticipation of lots of people subscribing, you're just going to end up doing a lot of work, more than it's worth for that one person. So watch yourself there. Lastly, I'd say pay it forward. If you have good fortune, pay it forward. If you can afford to pay decent rates for art or writing or whatever, just on a month-to-month basis, do it if you can, or give the work to people who really need it. That's my ethos when I go into this. As a purchaser, if you want to support people, be willing to pay a little bit more. Or if you buy a product and you really like it, go and find their Patreon and subscribe for $1 a month. It's only $12 a year. You're still getting the game book cheap. You get some support, you get some access to the creator, those sorts of things, and it doesn't really cost you much. It's less than a cup of coffee a month, and it makes a huge difference to the person on the other end. I think we all need to be more acutely aware across creative enterprises that the old models don't work, that pay has stagnated or disappeared, and we're going to have to make the extra effort to support people. But of course I would say that because I'm a creator. Right, so information for my Patreon and Subscribestar and everything else that I do is below this video. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're not watching on YouTube, go over to YouTube. If you do subscribe to my Patreon or Subscribestar, I am doing a video series on the RPG industry, how to create an RPG from start to finish, snout to tail, you might say, and hopefully you'll find some value elsewhere on this channel or in the other things that I do. Zang.
Aren't you a little tired of so-called horror media about shiny, sparkly, angsty, whiny monsters? I know I am, and that's why I created Actual Fucking Monsters, where you will play an actual fucking monster doing horrible and monstrous things and being tracked down and killed for it. Buy now at DriveThruRPG, post-mort.com or lulu.com.